a link in the chat box, this list, and we would really appreciate if each one of you can go to that link and register your name. It only takes like 5 seconds. As usual, we will be collecting questions from our attendees. For this, you can write them in the chat box or raise your hand after the presentation ends. So now, as you may see in the agenda, before I introduce our special guest for today's presentation, I will pass to Juan Pedro Searle, head of the Climate Change Unit of the Ministry of Energy in Chile, and member of the Interministerial Task Force on Article 6. Please, Juan Pedro. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mariela. On behalf of the Ministry of Energy, I would like to welcome all of you to this webinar, number 4, that is done in the context of Article 6 Task Force Group that we have conformed. It's a public roundtable for now. And today's issue is very, very important, very relevant, how to avoid overselling in the context of Article 6 and the potential trading of Itmoz. As Mariela said, we have a special guest. It's Randall. He will provide us with a presentation on a paper that Ian and others have participated. And this is so relevant because we've been discussing this in the task group, and this comes in a moment where we're now discussing some guidelines to use Article 6, and for that, this type of strategies and how to avoid potential overselling and how to avoid anything that could jeopardize the achievement of the NDC. It's a must, and we're just starting to understand the things behind this type of decisions. And my understanding, and I think this is the same concern that many countries have in the use of Article 6, is that we will use it and we have to use it, but we need to take care of this type of things that Randall will show us today. So I hope you can enjoy this presentation and be as live as possible, in the sense, pose any question that you have to Randall. We will try to, if not in English, we'll try to translate those. And if we cannot manage to answer all of the questions, we will try to do it in during email and send you some of them, of course, with the help, hopefully with the help of Randall. So let me give you the floor to Mariela again to introduce our special guest, and please pose a lot of questions because this is an essential matter. So thank you. You're mute.
Sorry, I haven't noticed that I was on mute. So thank you, Juan Pedro. I will now introduce to you all to Randall Spalding-Fetcher. He is a senior advisor with more than 23 years working in the field of energy and climate change policy. Randall has supported the next generation of carbon markets and climate finance funds under the Paris Agreement. With his wide experience in several countries around the globe on the development and GHG accounting of mitigation initiatives, he has served as a policy advisor and led capacity building programs to support governments, NGOs, and the private sector. He is one of the authors that will now present the results of this relevant study for national policy-making process regarding Article 6. So Randall, you can now share your screen, and the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm just going to switch screens here and get this going. So yeah, thank you very much to GIZ and to the government of Chile and everyone who helped to organize this and for the invitation to be here. I also really appreciate being able to do this in English because sadly I do not speak Spanish, so I appreciate everyone's patience with that. Just as a housekeeping, like everybody during the times of COVID, I do occasionally have internet problems, not usually, but if anything did happen, I can reconnect through another location within about 1 or 2 minutes, so shouldn't be a problem. So also thanks, just to acknowledge my co-authors who can't be here with us, but from Infras, SEI, and OK Institute, and the support from the Swedish Energy Agency for this study. And as the introduction has said, this really is probably the most important issue right now for Article 6, even though there's a lot of detail to work out in the rules. The big issue is that under the CDM, basically everything was good in the sense that from the point of view of the host country, the more CDM projects you had and the more units you issued, the better, because there was no downside. Now, suddenly that's changed in the Paris Agreement. Almost all potential host countries have their own goals. And therefore, they have to decide for any given mitigation intervention, are they going to use that for themselves or are they going to transfer it to someone else? Because there are these things called corresponding adjustments, which you'll hear a lot in this discussion, so that when you transfer any kind of emission reductions or mitigation outcomes, that gets added back to your inventory. So anything you transfer cannot help you to reach your own NDC goals. So given that, I'm going to walk through a couple of issues here. First of all, just what do we mean by overselling risk, or what are the different ways in which countries might oversell mitigation outcomes? Secondly, how countries would think about their own NDC implementation plans, like how would the decisions on that be made, and how does that then reflect itself in an overselling strategy? Then I'll walk through some examples that we prepared in the report. So there are about 10 or 11 of them, but they're in 3 broad categories. One being excluding your kind of NDC interventions from Article 6 cooperation. The second being sharing the mitigation outcomes that come out of these interventions with both the buyer and the seller. And then thirdly, some kind of reserve fund or basically kind of an insurance against missing your potential NDC goal in the future. And I'll wrap up with a couple of points on capacity building. So first on overselling risk, like what do we actually mean? And the classic one here is what we've often called the low-hanging fruit. In other words, if you sell low-cost mitigation outcomes, and I should say this is a strange word. It's part of the language now of the Paris Agreement. The reason we say mitigation outcomes instead of emission reductions is that some countries have NDC goals that are not expressed as emission reduction. They're expressed in, say, hectares of forest conserved or megawatts of renewable energy capacity installed. So this is a more generic term, but generally we are talking about emission reductions. So the first point here is that if you sold low-cost mitigation outcomes, but they were the ones you were going to use for your NDC, and now you need to go out and buy something more expensive, not buy something, excuse me, invest in something more expensive, that's a problem. So that's the problem of selling low-hanging fruit. But you could also have a situation where the mitigation outcomes that you transfer don't represent real reductions. In other words, they're from what we'd say in the CDM world were projects that were not additional. And we kind of, as a humorous approach to this, said this is selling non-existent fruit. Because again, you're making a transfer, your inventory is not going to go down because it wasn't a real reduction. And now this takes you farther away from your goal. A third possibility could be you sell mitigation outcomes from a project that does really produce mitigation, but that doesn't show up in your inventory. So think if you have a waste management project and it reduces emissions at a particular landfill site, but your national GHG inventory is very highly aggregated. So it doesn't look at the actions at each individual landfill in the country. You might have a situation where the national inventory doesn't actually change, even though you really accomplished something. So we call that selling uncounted fruit. And then the final one is there's a lot of debates about what happens. Not all countries have economy-wide NDC goals. So what if you're doing activities in sectors that are outside of your NDC goals and you transfer those mitigation outcomes? What is that? What happens there? Our focus in this study was mainly on the low-hanging fruit issue. There are some good papers on these other ones, And if you look at the original report for this, we will point you in that direction. But our real focus was, how do we deal with the risk of selling off the stuff that's inexpensive, and then the host country gets stuck having to buy stuff or having to invest in more expensive projects. And I want to do that, I want to illustrate this with a tool that's used a lot in this field. Many of you will have come across this before. It's called a marginal abatement cost curve. So what the figure on the left shows is, here's a group of 9 different mitigation interventions. So this might be, for example, when you were preparing your NDC, you analyze these 9 different interventions, and what the individual columns show is they're organized from the lowest abatement cost to the highest abatement cost. And the width of each column then shows the potential for emission reductions. Now, to make this easy for me, I have all the columns the same width, but they wouldn't be the same width, right? You could have many different sizes of interventions. But the point is, so we've got a bunch of interventions, we've ranked them from lowest to highest cost. Then a country might say, well, some of these interventions are not so attractive to us for our NDC. Maybe they don't align with our other development goals. Maybe they don't have enough co-benefits, so we're going to take them out. And so in this case, this country might say, okay, we're going to do A, B, C, F, G, H, and J, those 7 interventions. And that will help us to meet our goal, which is to reduce our emissions by 70 million tons in 2030, just as an example. So when we talk about low-hanging fruit here, then we're talking about this NDC package, as we call it. From this country's point of view, this is the least cost way to meet their goal that also aligns with their other policies. And so the question is, well, would you actually want to use any of these kind of technology interventions for Article 6 cooperation, or could that be a problem? And so that brings us to our first category of strategies. And this is a category that says, could you exclude these activities that you intended to use for your own NDC? Could you simply exclude those from Article 6 cooperation? And how would you do that? By the way, I'm going to do this because we don't have a lot of time. You'll see some of these strategies will be in black type and some will be in gray type. I'm only going to talk really about the ones in black type. If you have questions, I'll come back to the others in the Q&A. So the most obvious way to do this is just simply to have a negative list. So the country would say, okay, here are the interventions we're using. They publish that, and they're not going to approve any Article 6 programs in those technology areas. So pretty easy, very transparent. Of course, you have to have done this mitigation analysis first. Otherwise, you wouldn't know what to put on your list. And there are some limitations, but this is probably the simplest way to do that. There is some talk about going the other direction and say, well, instead of saying what we won't do in Article 6, you could have a positive list of, say, maybe some higher cost interventions, things that were kind of inaccessible for you to do on your own, and promote those as Article 6. The other possibility is you might say, well, we won't condition this on the specific technologies, but if we know it's going to cost us a certain amount to meet our NDC goal, anything for Article 6 needs to be stuff that's higher cost. So even if we maybe don't know the full range of possibilities, we say, you can only do Article 6 for interventions that have an abatement cost more than, say, $10 per ton of CO2, or 15 or 20 or whatever. Of course, the difficulty is that you've got to know, well, what is the relevant cost? What is the actual threshold you should be using? And there could be some perverse incentives for project developers to kind of game the system by making their intervention look expensive so that it will be allowed in Article 6. So interesting possibilities here, but there are some pros and cons. And I won't go into detail about this, but one thing that is being used by some of the donors now is to say, well, could we incorporate the NDC goals themselves into the baselines for crediting programs? And I can come back to that if people want to. The second major category was sharing mitigation outcomes. In other words, here we're saying, we're not going to restrict the types of projects or technologies, but we're not going to give the buyer all of the resulting mitigation outcomes. So we might say, okay, we'll do 50-50. you can come to us with any type of Article 6 proposal, and we're happy to get on board, but only half of the resulting mitigation outcomes are going to be transferred. Or, of course, it could be 60-40, 25-75. In fact, this is the challenge. I mean, this is very simple if you make this public, right? And the sharing is pretty straightforward. But how do you decide what level of sharing to do? Unless you have some sense of how important is this mitigation intervention compared to what your NDC plan was. So, but this may be where some countries start, just because you don't have to have done a detailed mitigation analysis to at least have this. And I think there are a number of donors that are also thinking about using this. Second possibility, which I won't go into in detail, is just you could limit the crediting period. So if you only allow the issuance of mitigation outcomes and transfer for a few years, but that it keeps delivering mitigation after that, then obviously beyond the crediting period stays with the host country. You could try to set more conservative baselines. So just say, well, rather than using this kind of complex NDC-derived baseline, we'll just say, 10% below business as usual. And again, that keeps aside some of those mitigation results for the host country. The way to really ensure this without any question, of course, would be to say, well, we're not going to do any transfers until we know we're going to meet our goals. And that might be, 2028 or 2029. And that would eliminate the risk of overselling. It probably eliminates all of your Article 6 cooperation as well, though, because who's going to want to wait until 1 or 2 years before their own NDC has to be met to know whether they can actually purchase units from you. But there could be some middle ground where you transfer part of the stuff now and then part of it later, right? But it's worth considering. So the final group was thinking about some kind of reserve fund. So could we, for example, charge a levy on all Article 6 transactions that goes into a reserve fund? And then if the NDC goal is not looking good, maybe that money is used either to go onto the international market and buy back some mitigation outcomes, or to invest more domestically. I should have said at the beginning, most of you probably know what an Itmo is, but just in case, this is a new term from the Paris Agreement, and it means internationally transferred mitigation outcomes. So it's the generic name for the type of transfers between countries which can then be used by the purchaser to meet part of their NDC goal. So lots of fun acronyms in the CDM, in the carbon market world. There's a second one that's also interesting. It's an idea of what's been called two-part pricing for Itmoz, and I'm going to just show you a graph to illustrate that. So to go back to our marginal abatement cost curve. So what this shows is a country that's looked at what they need to meet their goal of 70 million tons, and you'll see there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, about 7 interventions here. Now the question is, would there be a way for them to use option B for trading, but still be okay reaching their goal? And one way to do that would be to say, well, this graph shows that the abatement cost for option B is about $7 a ton. So at least that much money needs to go to the project developer to actually pay for the incremental cost of this intervention. But beyond that, the gap between there and $20, and why $20? Well, if this country cannot implement, or I should say, if they don't get the credit for option B because they've transferred it, what's the next most expensive thing they would have to implement to still meet their goal? It's what's indicated here as option D. And option D, the cost is $20 a ton. In other words, you could say, if we want to make sure we have enough money in the country to do that, there needs to be a second part of the pricing that this gap between $7 and $20. So this is being explored by a couple of funds. It's an interesting idea, and it might help you have a bit of security. Obviously, you have to know what the numbers are, though, right? So the negotiations become a bit more elaborate because where does the extra money go? Does it go to it obviously can't go to the project developer, but if it goes to the country, how do they put that aside for future mitigation? So this is all of these are new, right? Because no countries up until now ever had to worry about overselling. Well, that's not entirely true. In fact, if you look at joint implementation under the Kyoto Protocol, in that case, those countries all did have some type of goals. And you did see a reluctance among, for example, some European countries to engage in JI because they were worried that if they did, they might be at risk of overselling as well. So it did come up, but not for developing countries. So the final section of this report is an assessment of the strategies. And there's a lot of information here. So I'm going to highlight just 3 or 4 points. First point is what we did is we took all the different strategies and we looked at their impact on 3 different criteria. Number 1, the risk of overselling, like how much does it really affect that? Number 2, how much burden is there on the government to implement? How hard is this to implement? And thirdly, how does it affect the potential for actual transfer volumes, right? How does it affect the market this country might have for Article 6? So those are the categories. First thing I want to point out is the burden, potential burden on government may depend on whether they've done this NDC costing exercise, right? Because as I mentioned earlier, the negative list idea is very easy to do if you have that costing exercise. In other words, if you have the list of interventions you want to use. But if you don't have that, it's more difficult. I mean, there'd be some cost because you have to do that analysis first. So that's why sometimes there's a difference between the rating, whether it's green, meaning it's looking pretty good on that criteria, or yellow to orange, meaning it's more of a barrier. That's the first point. The second point, like I said earlier, the intervention that gives you the highest risk reduction is obviously conditional transfers. In other words, nothing's transferred until we're certain that we're going to meet our goal. But you'll see this is, of course, indicated in red in transfer volumes because there probably won't be much activity for Article 6. The last point would be, again, I think I mentioned at the beginning, a good starting point, probably from many countries who've done some mitigation analysis or who are developing an NDC implementation plan, might be the negative list because it's fairly simple. It does reduce quite a lot of risk, and it's not that complicated as long as there is some current analysis to back it up. Of course, all of these will reduce transfers to some extent, but they have to. That's the whole point. If you transferred everything without thinking about any of these issues, you might miss your NDC goal. So last couple of points. First of all, overselling is a real risk. I mean, it really has to be addressed. It is one of the main barriers to a lot of countries moving forward and creating a thriving market. Secondly, as you saw, the strategies all have their pros and cons, right? So there's no one strategy that's going to meet everyone's needs. It will depend on how ambitious the host country's pledges are, what available mitigation options they have and the cost of those, how much data they have on those mitigation options, and the capacity of the government to manage whatever strategy they're trying to implement, which leads to that we actually have a section about capacity building in the report. All I will say here is that in the short term, what's so important is that countries do this analysis, right? Each country needs to understand what are our options, what do we need to get to our NDC, and what does that still leave us in terms of opportunities for engagement, and what's then the best strategy from our point of view on how we ensure this NDC compliance while benefiting from Article 6 cooperation. So I'm going to leave it there, and let's see. Yes, I think that went back to the speaker, and I'm happy to take some questions.
Thanks, Randall. Yeah, I would like to ask you to ask questions in the chat, and probably Juan Pedro has one or more questions for you.
Yeah, looking at the chat, there's no question, I guess, still. Yeah, so thank you very much, Randall, for this presentation. I encourage everyone to read the paper in its entirety because it's very interesting. I have one maybe clarification from you, Randall. I'm gonna bring you back to the categories of overselling that you showed us at the beginning. So one that caught my attention was the third one, about the risk of overselling if the acquiring country does not reflect the, I mean, the Itmoz in their inventories. So my question or clarification on that one is, why is that a risk of overselling when you don't, I mean, you don't have control of what the acquiring country does or will do with Itmoz? And but from the seller perspective, if you have clarity on how much Itmoz are going out of the country, if you wish, then you have to do this corresponding adjustment, and you need to have clarity as a seller that you're more or less sure that you won't jeopardize your NDC, and it's difficult. I mean, but I don't see that as an overselling risk. Maybe I misunderstood your point there. And also the other one regarding but it's not a category, but you also post this about the ambition. I mean, you related the NDC ambition with the risk of overselling. Because my understanding is that, okay, if you have a more loose NDC, I don't know, you may be selling something that it's not real emission reductions, right? So you're in trouble, and of course the seller will be in trouble because the seller won't know how robust is this emission reduction that it's acquiring. So I want you to clarify first that overselling category concerning the acquiring party, and also this relationship between the ambition and the risk of overselling from the seller's perspective.
Okay, good. Those are both really, really helpful questions, and I think it will probably flesh out a little bit of this. So for the first question, let me just take a step back to remind everybody of how this works. So let's say let's say with no action, my national emissions in 2030 would be 100 million tons, right? That's business as usual. And I'm sure I do have a graph of this. I just don't have time to find it right now. But let's say, yeah, if we didn't do anything, we'd have 100 million tons in 2030. Now then someone comes and says, I want to do an Article 6. Oh, sorry. And let's say our goal is to get to 90, right? So we've set out our goal. So somebody comes to us and says, I want to do an Article 6 cooperation with you, and it's going to reduce 10 million tons. We say, fantastic. So the way it works, the implementation, it's implemented. We calculate the emission reductions, and in fact, yes, we can verify it's 10 million tons, which means, in fact, your inventory goes down to 90. You transfer the 10 million tons. Now, what a corresponding adjustment means is the 10 million tons you transferred is added back to your inventory for purposes of NDC reporting. So when you report your progress towards your NDC in 2030, what you will report is not 90. Even though your inventory shows 90 million tons, what you will report is 100 million tons. Then this makes sense because the 10 million tons was not yours, it was the buying countries, right? So that's corresponding difference. Now here's the problem. Let's say, go back to my waste management example. Let's say we've done some landfill gas projects, but your national inventory for waste management is highly aggregated. So your BAU is still 100 million tons. You do a 10 million ton project in transfer, but your inventory is listed still, is calculated as 100 million tons. So with the corresponding adjustment, actually, your reported emissions are going to be 110 million tons. So in fact, this transaction, it's not that just didn't help you get to your NDC goal, it took you further away from your NDC goal because you get hit with the corresponding adjustment and your reported inventory didn't go down. And I'll circulate through the organizers after this. There's a analysis, I think Infras and OCO Institute did a really good analysis of this where they looked across kind of the key sectors and project types to figure out where this risk is the greatest. Like energy sector, it tends not to be a big risk, but in a lot of industrial projects, waste, forestry, even far more, there's a real mismatch between how detailed and disaggregated the analysis is for crediting projects versus the way countries manage their inventories. So that's the first question.
Can I just intervene a little here? Yes. So okay, so I understand, but then it's not maybe a problem of overselling because the acquiring party is not reflecting it in its inventory. It's more related to maybe that the seller country does not have the capacities or the abilities or the data to do a proper corresponding adjustment. You see what I mean? It's not. No.
So let's see. So it's not about the acquiring country at all. I'm assuming in all cases the acquiring country gets the Itmoz and they use them against their NDC. So this is all about the transferring of the host country.
Okay.
But you're right. Here the issue is not so much that somebody sold too much and wasn't keeping track of their contracts well. The issue is that the country doesn't yet have the capacity to do a greenhouse gas inventory that is as disaggregated as kind of project-based or programmatic crediting is. So there's a mismatch between the way the inventory is managed and the way the MRV system for these individual projects. So which means that the response, like the way to reduce this overselling risk, and this is why I didn't touch on it, is actually around building more disaggregated inventory systems. Right. It's not about pricing issues or positive or negative lists. It's actually just about having a much more detailed greenhouse gas inventory.
Super.
Okay, so let me then come to the second point, which was about ambition. And I guess here the short answer is, an unambitious goal means that my NDC target is actually above business as usual. I mean, that's the kind of formal definition. And if that's the case, I can really sell as much as I want and have corresponding adjustments, and it's not going to make any difference. Almost by definition, I'm not going to miss my goal because the goal is actually
very, very low. Yeah.
So that's why. So what you tend to see is that countries, the more ambitious the country is, of course, this is a good thing for the global environment and for the whole climate problem, but it also becomes more and more challenging for Article 6 cooperation. Another way to think about it is this: if by your own analysis, you know that in order to reach your NDC goal, you will be implementing a series of interventions, and that the most expensive of those gets you up to, say, a marginal cost of $15 or $20, then you definitely don't ever want to sell Itmoz for less than $15 or $20, because anything that's more cost effective than that, you need for your own goals. Right. And this can be quite stark. We've looked at a couple of countries where it actually meant they shouldn't sell something for under $20, and no one has ever really thought about that in the past. What I mean is that they might have maybe wanted a higher price, so they can fund a better project, but we haven't really had to think about the kind of opportunity cost of transferring emission reductions. I hope that answers that question.
Yeah, thank you. Mariela, I'm seeing that people are posing some questions. Are you going to put it on the screen, or?
Yeah, we have it, and we try to show in the screen now.
Give me a second.
Yeah.
Also, if you want, you could just read the question out once you chose. I don't know how many there are, but
not that many, but interesting ones.
Okay. I will read the first. So Marlene Gerner is asking. Okay, I have the first one from her.
Nakita, it's already there, so Randall can.
You can read the one that it's about how you would adjust the table you showed. I think it's the last table, maybe. Considering that NDCs will also have to increase over time regarding the negative positive list might change.
Yes, so let me deal with it. That's a very good question. And in fact, all of those strategies need to be updated regularly, right? So for example, and of course, countries should be doing this anyway, because every 2 years you have to produce your biennial transparency report, and you need to say, well, here's the actual trend of our emissions. Here are our goals. Either we're on track or we're not off track. So absolutely, if you might have a negative list based on your early NDC analysis, but at this point in 2020, you should probably take another look at that before you use this formally for an Article 6 strategy. Yeah, you probably should look at that. And 2 or 3 years from now, you probably want to look at it again, because the cost of mitigation options, how easy it is to implement, all that is very dynamic. So I think any of these strategies you would want to revisit every 2 or 3 years. The other thing that might influence this is, let's say in your first 2 or 3 years, you actually don't have any Article 6 cooperation. You might then want to loosen things up a bit, right? Because you can afford to do more. On the other hand, if you find that in the first couple of years of this decade, you've already committed to sell, millions of tons of emission reductions, you might want to back things off a little bit and be a little bit more stringent about what you're prepared to transfer, later in this first NDC cycle.
Thank you, Randall. Okay, so next question is regarding, given that Itmoz are yet to define, and we know they must be in the NDC, countries are still getting requests. So what is your view about this?
Yes, so I mean, in a way, there are a couple of different ways to look at this question, but what we do know is that anything you transfer under the Paris Agreement, you can't use for your own NDC, right? I mean, so the principle of double counting is there in all the rules. Exactly how that's implemented might change, but I think the most important thing that people should understand even now is, if you transfer it, you can't use it, which means if you're getting requests now, and I assume you mean requests about potential Article 6 engagement, you need to be looking at these strategies right away. So you need to be thinking about, have we done an analysis of how we're going to meet our NDC? And based on that analysis, can we decide either, which types of projects we will and won't use in Article 6, or what kind of pricing we should have? So I would encourage people to be thinking about these strategies now. In a way, you don't need the final Article 6 rules to think about this, because the basic principle of no double counting is not going to change. How it's implemented might, but this work really is urgent, I think, for countries. And what you definitely don't want to do is just enter into some agreement and say, we'll give you whatever we want at whatever price, and no limitations, because then what if that was the best thing you could have done for your NDC? So yeah, it's worth talking about this. I should also add, it isn't just that the potential host countries are concerned about this. The acquiring countries are also very worried about this, because think about it. If Sweden or Germany or Norway buys a bunch of Itmoz from somebody, and that country doesn't meet their NDC goal, this is very bad for them politically, right? Now, not only internationally, but even domestically. So it actually is in both parties' interest in the transaction. It's in both parties' interest to ensure that there is no overselling, which is why we have argued that any of the funds that are doing Article 6 pilots should be supporting countries in doing this analysis, right? Because without this analysis, neither side can be really confident that this transaction is going to do what it's supposed to do. And what's Article 6? What's the purpose of Article 6? It's to increase the ambition of the Paris Agreement and to have cost-effective mitigation, sustainable development, and certainly not to jeopardize anyone's goals.
Yes, thank you. Okay, and the next question is, it says, you mentioned capacity building as a key measure in the selling countries. Could you detail a bit what are the important issues and whether you have noted willingness in the international community to support these activities? Yeah.
Yes, very good question. So I think there are, you could say there are two parts to the capacity building. I mean, one is there's an analytical component, right? Which is, do you know what options you have to meet your NDC and what their costs are, et cetera? So there's some analysis that has to be done to, in a way, develop that marginal abatement cost curve, and also to relate it to national development priorities, et cetera. So if you go back to the language of the presentation, you have to craft the NDC package. That's one part of capacity building. And the second part is probably you need a national kind of dialogue where you look at these different strategies in relation to what you now know about your NDC implementation plan and decide, okay, for our particular country, which of these strategies should we use and where should we start? So that's what you should do. There is a willingness, I think. So we have done the Partnership for Market Readiness is so we finished a project in Colombia that addressed some of these issues. And we're in the middle of one in Jordan that will also address these issues. The PMR supporting work in Turkey, and they have just, I think there was just a tender, so the project just started in Mexico. So there are a few countries being supported by the PMR on this. I mean, obviously, GIZ and their supporters and the German government is supporting this because it's going to be obviously part of the discussion in Chile. So I think there is an interest on both sides, again, because it is not in the interest for an acquiring country to buy Itmoz and then have the seller not meet their goal. That's not good. And I think we all recognize that. So I think there is, the only challenge I think here is that there isn't necessarily enough money going into this, right? And this is always the problem, right? This work is not inexpensive. I would say, you're going to need $100,000, $200,000 per country probably, unless there's already a very deep analytical base there. You need a pretty big chunk of money per country to do this. If I go back to the very old days, maybe almost 20 years ago, there was a program called the National CDM Strategy Study that was supported by the World Bank. And they went through, it must have been a couple of dozen countries. And they actually did something quite similar. They did mitigation cost curves and helped the country think about priorities, and in that case, promote different CDM projects. So I think we need a lot more money flowing through things like NDC partnership and the long-term low-emission development strategy partnership through those channels to do this kind of work.
Thank you. I think there's another.
Yeah, I was going to read it. This is about the prices of the Itmoz.
Yes.
So, Rodrigo Rojo asks, the more the market operates for Itmoz, higher will be carbon price volatility. How to offer certainty or financial sustainability to long repayment projects? How to manage prices to avoid disincentivize medium and big size projects interest for Itmoz transactions?
Yeah, so there are a lot of good points here, actually. I mean, there's a point about overall pricing level and what does it mean, what are the likely pricing levels that we might see and what influences that? And there's a point about volatility. Let me actually address that one first. So I think, because the volatility issue relates a little bit to what types of contracts do we anticipate for these projects? And, and in contrast to the CDM, where it was often private to private contracts, probably for Itmoz, that's not impossible, or at a minimum, governments have to be involved, right? Because governments have to authorize not only the activities, but they have to authorize each transfer of mitigation outcomes. So you can't, a private entity cannot own, well, as far as I understand, they can't own an Itmo, nor can they sell an Itmo, right? So there's going to be have to be new contractual arrangements, and those contractual arrangements can to some extent address the volatility issue, right? Because just as we had under the CDM, you could have long-term fixed price contracts, you could have contracts that had partially fixed price and then a floating part. So there are a whole lot of variations there. And it's those contractual arrangements on pricing that can help to, I think, give the investors in the host country some certainty. The other thing that I mentioned earlier, of course, is the problem with crediting periods and updating NDCs. And that is, on one hand, short crediting periods and updating them often as the NDC is updated sounds like a good idea in terms of not transferring too much. But it leads to what you're pointing to here, is that it can lead to a focus on short-term, quick payback, small projects. So we have to kind of balance maybe the need to reduce overselling risk with the need to promote large, longer-term projects. So somewhere in the middle, we're going to find the right place. But there are some trade-offs in terms of what type of crediting periods we use. So if there are other things that I didn't cover there, please let me know. You can put something again in the chat box.
Okay.
I was able to post one.
Thank you, Juan Pedro.
Pero hay otra ahí de la Marlene.
Yeah, but yeah, we will go by order. So seems like a lot of the risks of using Article 6 are located in the selling country. Do you think the selling strategies could also help to share the risk with the buying country? Example, long-term contracts versus accounting for changing advances?
Yeah, it's a very good point. So a couple of thoughts here. I mean, number one is, as we've said, key to reducing these risks is building the capacity needed to actually understand what the risks are, right? So one thing that buyers can do is they can support countries in doing this mitigation analysis and thinking through what do they need for their NDC, what can they safely transfer, etc. So that's one form of cooperation. A second issue is the buyer could decide, and I think actually this isn't a discussion in some of the big funds, the buyer might say, if the host country is not going to reach their goal, then the buyer might agree not to use all of those Itmoz for their own NDCs, right? In other words, you could think about it kind of as instead of treating this as carbon finance, where it's actually used for your goals, you kind of convert it into climate finance. Climate finance generally means money that's flowing that doesn't have a kind of payment in terms of credits used towards NDCs, right? So yeah, there could be some risk sharing there that the buyer country says, well, in a way, we'll only cash in these Itmoz for our own NDC if we see that you're on track. And the third thing I would mention is, host countries also need a really, really strong system for regular accounting and reporting. And unfortunately, the Paris Agreement includes this, right? So the Paris Agreement, Article 13, the Enhanced Transparency Framework, does require a lot more reporting and much more regular updates of inventories, and then matching that with transfers and to figure out what's the resulting impact on progress towards NDC goals. So getting that Article 13 reporting system up, and the Article 6, there are a bunch of reporting requirements for Article 6, getting that MRV system in place in the country is also very, very important, because that's the way you will know well in advance if there are any red flags in terms of risks to NDC compliance.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. And Juan Pedro, maybe you can yourself ask your question.
Yeah,
Right.
I think the second part is similar to what Marlene has asked. So, Randall, do you see a role of carbon budgets as a means to control NDC achievement and the overselling of Itmoz? That's one. And the other one was very similar to Marlene's, and how about the acquiring party to share some of the risks, for instance, investment, as a way to encourage Article 6 participation and detour a bit from typical CDM approach? Because I think, why would a country like Chile bother in engaging in this, Article 6 clubs when we will need out those reductions, and the companies here, maybe the banks and also the public sectors doing all the efforts, and the acquiring party just buying the credits. So I think we should detour a little bit from the CM, I guess.
Just to clarify, tell me what you mean about carbon budgets.
For instance, if you have, let's say, a limit in terms of the maximum emissions that we should have in order to achieve our NDC, for instance, in the new NDC, we have a carbon budget of 10 years.
Yes.
So
yes.
you have a maximum. You cannot deviate from that. Okay. So if you have this type of, I would say, instruments, I don't know, you can control better your trajectory, and then you will say, okay, I'm now capable of selling X amounts of credit because I'm pretty sure that I will still reach the goal.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. You're absolutely right. That's an excellent idea. And in fact, so currently in the draft rules for Article 6.2, which of course are still being debated, but there is this issue of how do you account for single-year goals. So if you have only a 2030 goal, what do you do if you're transferring Itmoz in 2024? And they're basically, I mean, we could, at the end of the last negotiations, there were two main options left. One is that you average the Itmoz sales for the whole time and apply that to 2030, or what you're talking about, you actually develop a kind of trajectory that moves you progressively towards your goal. And I think all the papers I've seen suggest that that's the best way to go, right? You should set a realistic trajectory along the way. And that way, then you can apply essentially the Itmoz all along the way to that trajectory. So I definitely agree that that's something countries should be considering. What it also means, though, is that countries will have to all quantify their NDC goals, right? And a lot of them actually aren't quantified. I mean, because if you say, well, we'll reduce our emissions 10% versus business as usual, at some point you have to say what business as usual is. And this is very difficult for a lot of countries. There's a lot of reluctance, and I understand why, because once you say that's BAU, well, what happens if there's a huge change in your economy that you weren't anticipating? But in principle, yes, some type of carbon budget or trajectory will make it much easier to manage NDC compliance and know early on if there are any risks from Itmoz transfers. And then I think that, so the second part, let me give the example from Colombia, because I think this was really, really helpful. So the University of Los Andes did some very detailed mitigation analysis prior to Colombia submitting their NDC, and that has since been updated. What they found is, you know, if you look at all the options that might be used for their unconditional goal, I think the most expensive one was about $18. So first thing you could say is, if you've identified some interventions that were more expensive than that, by all means, use those as Article 6, right? So that's one option, is you some of those higher cost things that maybe they wouldn't have done themselves. There were some very large scale forestry things that were for some reason were more expensive, I think. That might be an option. But also in that process, very interestingly, they identified there were a number of interventions which, even though on paper they looked cost effective, they were very difficult for Colombia to do on their own. In fact, I think a couple of them had to do with steel and aluminum manufacturing technologies, like major changes in these process technologies in these large metals and manufacturing facilities. And then there were also some that were a lot around building design and urban design, which again could be very cost effective, but there wasn't a lot of local experience. So in their NDC planning, they had kind of put those interventions aside. They didn't include them in their NDC plan because they felt like they couldn't do that on their own. Again, those could be ideal areas for cooperation because there is experience with those technologies in other countries. So that's the second, you know, the first category is maybe think about some of the high cost stuff that you would have never considered for CDM. That might be a place. And the second is, are there things that, although they might in theory pay for themselves, they're not going to happen because you need external, in other kinds of external input on policy reform or technology implementation. That could be an area. But you're absolutely right. It's a much more focused strategy potentially than the early days of CDM, when basically it was all good.
Thank you, Randall and Juan Pedro. I wanted to say that we are just on time. We have 2 minutes left. So if you have like final comments or something you want to say?
Me or Randall, or maybe someone has a burning question still from the audience?
Yeah, you can all, the audience can always raise your hand and ask the question yourself, of course.
Maybe
let me
go ahead,
Marlene, Marlene. No, yeah, let me just maybe on the issue of I mean, outside the NDC. So I think that I mean that will happen or may happen, but still I guess I don't know. My understanding is that if you have a like Brazil, for instance, Brazil is saying that everything that it's outside the NDC is allowed to participate in Article 6.4 mostly. So my understanding is that okay, you may have activities outside the NDC, but still you need to find a way to reflect those in your inventory. Otherwise you will be selling, I mean, hot air or I mean, there will not be real reductions if you're not able to reflect those in the inventory and do the summing or the ¿cómo se dice restar? Se me olvidó.
Yeah.
Like,
I see the
Action, I
point.
guess.
Just really quickly. I mean, it isn't even so much that even if your inventory works well, if it's outside your NDC, you're not reporting that inventory as part of your NDC. So the problem with if you have to implement a corresponding adjustment, but there's no reduction in emissions inside of the scope of your NDC, again, what it means is it's taking you farther away from your goals.
Yeah.
So what we've suggested to countries is, because the jury is kind of still out on exactly how this is going to work, we would encourage them in their pilot activities to focus on things inside of their NDC. Just because there's a lot of extra risk, I would argue, associated with trying to do something outside of it. Might be possible. Second thing is, my understanding is that most of the donors are not interested in pilot activities outside of the NDC because they're also concerned about how it might play out.
Thank you. Marlene?
Okay, hi everyone. Thank you, Randall. Very interesting discussion. Sorry for asking so many questions. I could keep going for a while. But the last thing I wanted to ask you, that's kind of complicated to write down. I had asked about the capacity building, and you said that you think that it's also in the interest of the buying country to support good transparency and reporting, and that the selling countries will also achieve their goals. So I'm wondering if there could maybe arise a risk of being supported directly by a country that you want to engage in some kind of Itmoz commerce with, because of course both parties will have interests in that. So I'm not sure if I can explain it clearly, but do you think there could be a risk arising from that?
Well, first of all, many countries are going to have multiple partnerships on Article 6, right? So I don't think it would be hard for unless it's a very small country, but they think this is my only chance. I don't think you're going to intentionally mess up your MRV system, for that one transaction. But maybe more importantly is the work that needs to be done is really to kind of set up the MRV systems which are required by the Paris Agreement. So in a way, their structure and the way they will work is largely going to be determined by the rules. So helping countries to do that and to do it well, I think is going to benefit everybody and be pretty transparent. It would be different, you're right, if the issue was the countries have to decide on, I don't know, they get to decide on themselves what the reductions were, and they don't verify that with a third party. Yes, then I think there's but in terms of the kind of broader kind of readiness building for this, there I think it's a win-win because it is the kind of foundation for making this more transparent.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, thanks.
Juan Pedro, you're on mute.
Yeah, no, I mean, thank you, Randall. Very interesting, And
Good
thank
question.
you. Yeah. So you want to say some final words before closing this?
So I think I've said all I need. Just thank you for the invitation. I think it's been very useful, very interesting questions. And
yeah, but this is a very relevant. I mean, this is the issue, I guess, right? It's so important concerning Article 6. Yeah. So on my side, thank you very much for your enthusiasm and willingness to be here today. Thank you, everyone. I don't know how many people showed up today. More than
40.
More than 40, yeah.
Yeah.
Which is really good for the time being, I guess. So many webinars.
Yes.
In this week. So thank you again, and thank you everyone. Also on behalf of the Ministry of Energy, we'll see you again in the next webinar. So thanks, Randall.
All right, thank you. Bye.
And I hope to see you physically in some of the PMR meetings, maybe next year. Hopefully.
Okay, thank you, Randall. Thank you, Juan Pedro. Thank you, everyone.
Okay, bye.
See you next webinar.
Vemos.
Bye.
Thank you all.